No, on behalf of the Catholic Health Association, it really is my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Caroljean CJ Willie. She is a Sister of Charity here in Cincinnati. CJ's presentation, Laudato Si, a blueprint for the 21st century, really is so timely and relevant this morning. If you think about what's going on in Florida with Hurricane Ian, you think of just the daily headlines that we see, unfortunately, of wildfires, flooding, the heat. I don't know if you all saw the story a few weeks ago about China's summer, and that they were saying that's our future, and they went 8 weeks with record heat. So it's pretty scary out there. So I think really interested to hear what you have to say about this very important topic. And on a positive note, though, it's also very timely because we are in season of creation, and that'll end next week with the Feast of St. Francis. As someone who's been in Catholic healthcare for now almost 20 years, 15 of those were actually with a Franciscan health system. So I feel really fortunate to have been formed in the Franciscan tradition, learning so much about St. Francis, his love of the environment, of nature, and how that really leads to our spirituality and being in connection with nature. So the Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si really has had a profound impact on me. And the Holy Father speaks of an integral ecology, which shows the intimate connection between our care for each other and for the earth. And for those of us serving in Catholic healthcare, the environment in which we live really has such a direct relationship to the health of our patients and our communities. I think many of you are obviously familiar with the term social determinants of health, and those have traditionally been thought of things like food security, housing insecurity, lack of transportation, but more and more we're seeing environmental degradation being a direct lead to poor health outcomes. And so in Catholic healthcare, we've really kind of leaned in over the last several years in trying to address environmental concerns at the local, state, and national level. I'm pleased that four of our members and CHA as an association have signed up for the Laudato Si Action Platform. We're really encouraging more of our members to do that. We actually have, I'm going to make a couple of commercials here. One is we've got a webinar a week from today, October 6th. It's really open to anybody, and it's actually about how to sign up on the Laudato Si Action Platform, and I think, CJ, you're going to speak maybe to some of that. The platform's a really cool tool if you haven't checked it out. And really, it's great to see that Catholic healthcare in the United States is stepping up when it comes to environmental sustainability. Our members are really sharing with each other best practices. Again, another sales pitch. Right outside the door here, we have copies of our journal, Health Progress, and last fall we did an issue on healthcare and the environment. So there's a lot of really good articles about what we're doing at a national level to really try to make an impact in lowering our carbon footprint and becoming more environmentally sustainable. So with all of that context about Catholic healthcare, I really am excited to hear from CJ on this topic. So in the way of a formal introduction, CJ has extensive experience working with multiple cultures internationally as a teacher trainer, cultural diversity consultant, and retreat director. She is a frequent speaker at local, regional, national, and international conferences, and served 2 terms as the NGO representative at the United Nations for the Sisters of Charity Federation, and continues to work with various microfinancing projects across Africa. CJ holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Sociology, a Master's degree in Reading, and a Ph.D. in Multicultural Education. She currently serves as the Program Director for EarthConnection. That's an environmental center right here in Cincinnati. So it is my distinct pleasure to again welcome Sister Caroljean CJ Willie. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Good morning. Well, this is a difficult audience to speak on Laudato Si with because you already know so much. And so it's a challenge to say, well, what don't you know? Or what can I add to that? So I'm just going to have to back up a little bit here. I'd like to start with just a photo reflection on Laudato Si. So just to kind of put ourselves in a reflective mood. St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. This sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. St. Francis invites us to see nature as a magnificent book in which God speaks to us and grants us a glimpse of his infinite beauty and goodness. Both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. Each creature possesses its own particular goodness and perfection. Each reflects, in its own way, a ray of God's infinite wisdom and goodness. Soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. God has written a precious book whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. From panoramic vistas to the tiniest living form, nature is a constant source of wonder and awe. It is also a continuing revelation of the divine. Nature is God's art. Everything is related, and we human beings are united as brothers and sisters on a wonderful pilgrimage, woven together by the love God has for each of his creatures, and which also unites us in fond affection with Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother River, and Mother Earth. Interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. All Christian communities have an important role to play in ecological education. Pope Francis tells us there can be no renewal of our relationship with nature without a renewal of humanity itself. Inner peace is closely related to care for ecology and for the common good. It is reflected in a balanced lifestyle, together with a capacity for wonder, which takes us to a deeper understanding of life. An integral ecology includes taking time to recover a serene harmony with nature. We need an attitude of heart which accepts each moment as a gift from God to be lived to the full. Care for nature is part of a lifestyle which includes the capacity for living together and communion. The universe unfolds in God, who fills it completely. There is a mystical meaning to be found in a leaf, in a mountain trail, in a dewdrop, in a poor person's face. Everything is interconnected, and this invites us to develop a spirituality of that global solidarity which flows from the mystery of the Trinity. Amen. When we look at Laudato Si, we know that the title is taken from the first line of the encyclical, Laudato Si mi Señor, or Praise be to you, my Lord. We also know that it is taken from the Canticle of the Sun by St. Francis of Assisi. And it reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life. And Pope Francis, much like Pope John XXIII, wrote an encyclical for the world. not just for the Catholic community, but for the people of planet Earth. And he begins it by saying, I would like to enter into dialogue with all people about our common home. He says, I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. And two of the phrases that I came away from the UN with, when working particularly with smaller countries, were, everyone needs a place at the table. Okay? And the second one, or if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that is very much how they felt. So no decision about us without us. Now, Pope Francis wanted to make sure that people realize that he is not the first pope to engage in talk about the environment. And so he quotes from several of his predecessors. He talks about John Paul II, and although we give credit to Pope Francis for the term ecological conversion, it was actually John Paul II who coined that term the first time. Then he talks about Benedict XVI, and many people do not realize that he is actually known as the Green Pope, because he's the one that put the solar panels on the Vatican. Okay? And he also began to talk about the structural causes of the dysfunctions of our world economy and the need to look at our economic models of growth. Okay? And of course, Francis begins by talking about one of his most favorite people, St. Francis. And he says he is the example par excellence of care for the vulnerable and of an integral ecology lived out joyfully and authentically. And he shows us just how inseparable the bond is between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. And he invites us to see nature as that magnificent book that God has created for us. Now, one of the other things that Francis did was not simply rely on those near and around him in the Catholic community, but he invited people from multiple religious traditions to come and offer their advice. He invited scientists. Naomi Klein, many of you have read her book. She's a Jewish writer, and he invited her because she has spoken so eloquently and frequently on climate change and its effect on humanity. He really held up the role of ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, and it was he who said, for human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, to degrade the integrity of Earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the Earth of its natural forests or destroying its wetlands, by contaminating the Earth's waters, its land, its air, and its life. These are sins. And the quote that I used in the opening reflection, he took from a mystical Muslim poet because he wanted to also include the Muslim tradition in what he was saying. Now, Francis was very astute because he released the encyclical in 2015, and he did it on purpose at that time because there were major conferences coming up. But he also wanted us to see that he was not only talking about religious congregations doing this work, but he wanted to attach it to what civil society was doing as well. And so he went back and looked at the Earth Summit in 1992, and that was the first ever World Summit on the Earth, where people began for the first time as an international community to say, what's happening to our environment and what responsibility do we have? And like most of those international summits, nothing comes out of them right away. But eventually the Earth Charter came out of that. And that was Mikhail Gorbachev, Stephen Rockefeller from the United States, and Maurice Strong from Canada, who followed up on what came out of the Earth Summit. For 10 years, they spent interviewing people throughout the world before they wrote the Earth Charter. So it had input from countries throughout the world. If you haven't looked at it in a while, it is an incredible document. Okay. Then in 2012, the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon at that point, said we need to host another Earth Summit, and we need to bring together all of the countries of the world. So I was privileged to be able to attend that. But like most summits that involve government officials, there was a lot of talk. You know, we have to do this and we have to do that, but you do it, not me. However, while that conference was going on the other side of town, there was a much more interesting one going on. And most of us kind of gravitated across town to all of the indigenous peoples who had gotten together to give a conference for us and to tell us what was happening to their way of life. And then ultimately, out of the Rio Plus 20 conference, and again, it didn't happen right away, the Sustainable Development Goals came out. But as I mentioned earlier, he was trying to capitalize on the moment in 2015. He knew that there was a Financing for Development conference, which occurs periodically at the UN, where the world leaders get together to talk about what needs to be financed. And he wanted to be sure that the earth was a part of their consideration. Okay? And then he knew that the Sustainable Development Goals were going to be ratified by the General Assembly in September of 2015. And so he wanted to have some influence on that. Now, the conference in Rio was in 2012, and then the Sustainable Development Goals were worked on for 3 years before they were actually ratified. And many of you may remember the Millennium Development Goals, although here in the United States, not so much. I was speaking in India, and I was speaking at a school, and 6th graders there knew more about the Millennium Development Goals than any audience I had ever talked with in the United States. Every church there had the Millennium Development Goals posted and talked about frequently. Well, when the MDGs were written, they were kind of written by a few people in a back room at the UN. And when it came time for the Sustainable Development Goals, the smaller countries said, we need to be at the table. Okay? They said, yes, you wrote the Millennium Development Goals, and 7 of the 8 were what we had to do, not what the big countries had to do. You put all of the burden on us. We want to be sure that when the SDGs are written, that we all do our fair share. And so I can't tell you how many meetings we attended on the SDGs. And the desire was that they would be few in number and actionable. Okay? Well, the first draft had 78 goals. They decided that was a few too many. So finally they got it down to 17 goals. And then he also knew that that Paris Convention was going to take place, and he wanted to have some influence on that. Now, Pope Francis was at the UN in 2015. He did speak to the General Assembly. And these are the Sustainable Development Goals. I won't take the time to go through each of them, but if you look at them, the idea behind them is to eradicate poverty, but to do so collaborating between the poorer countries and the richer countries, that each has to do their fair share. Okay? The purpose of the Millennium Development Goals was to eradicate poverty by 1/2 by the year 2015. Obviously, that did not happen. Some good things did come out of it, okay, but for the most part, they didn't really achieve their goal. So these goals, they really wanted to implement them in every country. Okay? So what is Francis saying in Laudato Si? He says 14 times, everything is connected. Okay, he says you can't separate things. And then we saw changing views at the UN and internationally. Whoops, this is deciding to do it on its own. In Changing Views, we look on the left side, on my left, that we talked about sustainability having three elements: social, environmental, and economic. I don't know why it's doing that. On the right side, they realized that no longer could they do that. They weren't equal. Okay? So the economy became the center, followed by society, with the environment on the outside because it was the most important. You didn't have an economy or a society without a healthy environment. Okay? And so Pope Francis tells us that the human environment and the natural deteriorate together. We cannot adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to causes related to human and social degradation. He says there aren't two separate crises. There's one crisis with multiple dimensions. And he says we can't assure environmental protection. I don't know why it's doing that. It was fine earlier. Okay, based on financial calculations of cost and benefit. He says because the market doesn't take into account environmental costs. Okay? He says it's a moral issue for all of us, and that we cannot have authentic human development without looking at its moral character. Okay? And so I'm just going to ask you, just for 2 minutes at your table, to take a look at this question and ask yourself and share with each other. Have you heard priests in your parish speaking about concerns for pollution and climate change as an essential part of Catholic social teaching? Just share that for a few minutes. Okay, I know that's certainly not enough time to talk, but just to get you thinking about that. When I give talks on Catholic social teaching or Laudato Si, to Catholic audiences, they'll say to me, why have we never heard of this? And I generally say, go ask your pastor. Right. Climate change is a global problem, and it has grave implications: environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. And where I have the numbers there, that's where that is located in Laudato Si. And so this is what Pope Francis is talking about when he says everything is connected. This is not just a religious problem. This is a social problem, an economic problem, an environmental problem, a political problem. And we have to recognize how integrated they all are. And when we talk about climate change, and I think this summer we're certainly well aware that it has multiple ramifications, okay? Global warming was the term we used for a long period of time, and global warming actually is the underlying cause of a great deal of the climate change. But what we're seeing is what we saw this summer. You know, less snow and ice, okay, thawing permafrost. And of course, permafrost in last June in Russia, the permafrost was thawing in Siberia, where communities were built on the permafrost. And so was an oil refinery that collapsed into the rivers. Okay? In our own state of Alaska, there are many villages that have had to move because the permafrost, which is actually frozen soil but has been frozen for thousands of years, okay, is melting. And it's also releasing bacteria that we haven't seen for a long, long time. Okay, changes in plant and life cycle, warmer oceans, rising sea levels, damaged coral, more droughts and wildfires, we've certainly seen that, higher temperatures and more heat waves, stronger storms. I was glued to the TV last night watching what was happening in Florida because I'd lived there for so many years. And it's just unbelievable, the power of that storm. And so Francis is also saying, look, I'm not making this stuff up. There's a solid scientific consensus on this. 97% of the world's climate scientists agree that climate change is happening and it's us. Okay. Are there scientists who say it's not really that bad? Yes, but if you look, they're not climate scientists. Okay, and that's an important consideration. Okay. And again, he is re-emphasizing the fact that it's human activity that is causing this. Okay. He also, throughout the document, quotes from bishops from throughout the world. In this case, he's quoting from the Bolivian bishops, who are reminding us that both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. And so I want to give you some on-the-ground examples of this. When working at the United Nations, I did have the opportunity to travel extensively and to see a lot of this, but also to work with the ambassadors from a variety of countries on what was happening in their country. This particular one is from the island of Kiribati, or Kiribati as they call it. And Dr. Michael Roman is a friend of mine. We're former Peace Corps volunteers together. And he served in Kiribati, which is that little strip of land that you see there. If you look on this here, it shows you. Sorry, I thought I had turned that off. These embarrassing things happen. What can you do? Okay, so Kiribati is it's a series of islands stretched over a long, stretched out area, but they're all teeny tiny islands, and they're disappearing, literally. Mike came back from Kiribati about 10 years ago, and he's dedicated the rest of his life to working with the people from there. So he's helped to produce 2 movies on what is happening there, so that people recognize that these are real people who are being impacted. Okay. One of my first experiences at the UN was listening to the Prime Minister or the ambassador from Tuvalu stand up and say, "Is there a country here who will take our people? Because our country is disappearing." And then the next question was, what do you call a people whose country has disappeared? Okay. This is Ambassador Abdul Ghafoor Mohammed, and he and I shared a panel together at one point on climate change, and he was talking about its effect on his country, which is the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. And that consists of 200 islands. And there are about 315,000 people. It's the lowest average elevation in the world. And he was saying that their capital, Malé, is surrounded by a seawall, but there's no way they have the finances to surround all 200 islands with a seawall. And he said what's happening here is that the beaches are eroding, coral reefs and marine life are undermined, threaten livelihood of the people. There's a rise in climate-related illnesses such as dengue fever and others. And I served for a number of years on the island of St. Lucia in the Eastern Caribbean. We never even heard of dengue fever. Okay, and now it's prevalent, it's everywhere. Okay, and he's saying here, you keep talking about all of these statistics about what is happening. He says, but you have to realize that this is affecting millions of human lives right now in the world's poorest countries. And he added, so stop talking about it and do something. Okay? And so this is what's happening to a lot of these islands. Okay? This was Pakistan just 2 weeks ago. Okay? And these are pictures that I took in Tanzania when I was working with the microfinancing projects there. And it was the middle of the drought. It was right before the pandemic had started. And you can see all of their crops were just drying up. And one of the saddest things I have ever seen was watching the Maasai. This is a Maasai warrior, and the cow is the most important thing in their lives. Their whole life revolves around their cow. And we were driving through Maasai territory, and there were a group of Maasai with one cow, okay? And they were trying to push the cow up just a short incline, and the cow fell over, and it died. Now, that's not my picture because I could not take a picture of that. I just looked at the faces of those men. Their whole livelihood was just, it was gone in that moment, okay? And so Pope Francis reminds us that there's been a tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from the growing poverty caused by environmental degradation, okay? And we have to realize that it's two calls, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Okay. The IPCC report is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's released usually every 5 years or so. And although it's called the UN IPCC report, it's not written specifically by UN personnel. They gather the information from more than 600 scientists, climate scientists, from throughout the world. The first report was released in 1988, and at that point in time, they said, climate change is happening, and that's all they said. They're a rather conservative group in terms of how they evaluate things. But as the years have gone on, the most recent report is saying, you know, it is tragic, it is happening, it is now, and we can't afford to wait any longer. And they also are recognizing the impact on the poor that this is happening. Okay. Pope Francis reminds us about the common good. He says it's a central and unifying principle of social ethics. It calls for social peace, for stability and security provided by a certain order, and it cannot be achieved without particular concern for distributive justice. And he says the climate is a common good belonging to all, and it's meant for all. Okay. And he speaks throughout of the importance of everyone being at the table. As I mentioned earlier, no decision about us without us. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that's what he talks about repeatedly, that the people who are most impacted are the ones who have to have a say. We oftentimes go into countries with the best of intentions, but we don't listen to the local people. I worked for a number of years for the mission office in the Diocese of Orlando, and we had a sister project in the Dominican Republic. And they were telling me about this because it happened long before I got there. When they had first started the mission, they went into a village and they ascertained, the group from Orlando, ascertained that the people needed better education. So they went back to Orlando and they developed this whole program and they brought it back and presented it to the people in this village. And the people said, no, thank you. We need clean water. Of what value is it for you to give us better educational opportunities when our children are too sick to go to school? Okay? And that's a classic example of how the best of intentions, if we don't include the people we are working with, are meaningless. Okay? So he talks about the need for new forms of communication and cooperation in order to look out for the interests of small producers and preserve local ecosystems from destruction. As you know, he had that synod on the Amazon and met with many, many people throughout the Amazon. And that also is an excellent document. Okay, gotta be at the table. So the idea is we want to help people to move from a handout to a hand up. And systemic change is what is called for. And I want to give you a couple of examples to show you how meaningful small steps can be to make huge changes. A friend of mine, Sister Toni Temperiti, who is an O'Fallon Precious Blood sister, about 15 years ago, when she was about 55 at the time, took a sabbatical in Africa. And she went from Egypt down to South Africa, going through 22 African countries with 19 Australian college students who called her grandma. They slept out for 7 months every night in a pup tent. She came back to St. Louis and was eating in a restaurant and said, you know, for the cost of one meal, I could take a whole family out of poverty. Okay? And so she was a psychologist at the time, began to look at what she could do, went to Antigonish to the Coady Institute and studied about microfinancing, where she met Muhammad Yunus, who was the founder of microfinancing. And then she met a woman named Ingrid Monroe. And Ingrid had founded a microfinancing project in this area here. This is the Kibera slums, 1.5 million people in 1 square mile. Okay? And she said to Ingrid, she said, "I'd like to help you." And Ingrid said, "No, thank you." And she said, this is Ingrid. She says, "Well, why?" She says, "You're a Catholic sister, aren't you?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "You have too soft a heart." She said, "When people ask for things, you'll give it to them. And that doesn't help them." So Tony was very persistent, and she kept going back to Ingrid and saying, "But I want to learn from you." Now, Ingrid was from Sweden originally, and she and her Canadian husband had settled in Nairobi after she had worked with the United Nations, and they adopted 3 Kenyan children from the streets. And I have walked on those streets. These children just walk around all day long sniffing glue because there's no food. And they don't even know where their parents are or who their parents are anymore. Well, the children wanted to go back down on Saturday mornings to meet their friends again. So she took them down, and the women said to her, "Well, what are you going to do for us?" And she said, "What are you going to do for yourselves?" So she challenged them to save money. Now, I literally am talking about people lying in the streets, and she's saying, "You've got to save some money." Well, 50 women took up the challenge, and they saved maybe $1 a piece in 6 months. And she was able to double that for them. And her microfinancing group grew in 10 years from those 50 women to 300,000 borrowers throughout Kenya. Okay? And she always said, people have the right, the will, and the capacity to direct their own future. And so these are some of the people that I met when I was there that got a loan. And they are so happy just to have a stall in the marketplace. Okay, and that other one was Sister Tony. And Marie had been selling a little bit of fruit from her backyard. Now she has a stall on the main street. Okay, and she's making a very good income. She doesn't want to migrate to anywhere. She wants to stay right where she is, but she wants to be able to feed her family. Joyce was an exceptional case. Joyce was from the northern part of the country, from one of the tribal regions, and she'd lost her husband and most of her sons in the tribal warfare. So they found her on the streets in Nairobi. And Ingrid always says, "What do you know how to do?" And Joyce says, "Well, I know how to cook." So she got started with a little cooking session, a little stand on the side of the road. And now this is her restaurant where she employs 21 people. Okay, now she's an exceptional case. Not all of them advance that far, but it is possible. Okay? And then another project in Uganda, there was Sister Tony is from St. Louis, and by this point she had given up her private practice as a psychologist, and the community allowed her to go full-time into microfinancing partners in Africa. And a priest from Uganda was studying at St. Louis University and heard about her, so he came and he said, "Well, would you help my bishop?" And she said, "I don't do bishops." And he said, "Honest, my bishop is different." So he came to her 3 or 4 times, and finally she said, "I'll go meet your bishop." And this is Bishop Kagwa, who is just was an incredible human being. He died last year. And he had started a project like Heifer International, but with just a few cows that he had. Because he said he realized that he couldn't meet people's spiritual needs if he didn't meet their physical needs. And in talking with the people, they said if they had a cow, it could get them out of poverty. And so what he wanted from us was some seed money to be able to buy more cows. Okay? And so we visited, I've been to these people's homes several times, and we visited to see what they have done. Now, Peter and Josephine got one of the first cows. Okay, so they wanted to show us every level of this. Then the bishop realized that, these cows poop every day. And he worked with a local engineer, and they created a biogas system. There was no electricity in this particular area. And so now the people can invest in the biogas system, and they have electricity for their home and gas for cooking. This doesn't happen all at once. They have to save up some money for this. And so Peter was demonstrating how this works. Okay, now they have lots of chickens. I think I saw them right before the pandemic, and they now have 1,500 chickens. But Josephine wanted to cook a meal for us on her new stove. And she was so proud of that stove. Okay, and now they have coffee beans. And they have put 7 of their children through the university. So you've taken an entire generation for the cost of one $800 cow. And they have to pay that money back. So it goes on and on and on. When they get the cow, it is pregnant. And then they agree to raise that calf for 9 to 12 months and then pass it on to another family. And I learned that you can actually determine the sex of the cow by what you inject it with. Okay. He also was very concerned that this not only be available to Catholics in the diocese, but to everyone. So this was a Muslim family that we visited who had just gotten their cow. And the bishop insists that they have personal cleanliness, so they have to build a latrine. And in several of the places we visited, they had this stick sitting in the back there. And finally we asked, well, what's the stick for? And they said, oh, that's for the snakes. And so now he's building bricks in his front yard in order to build a brick home instead of the mud one. And now all of these children are in school. Then he talked about politicians. And what was interesting is before this happened, many of our politicians were saying, the Pope's writing about the environment. What does he know about that? That's a science thing. He doesn't know anything about that. What they didn't know is that he's a scientist. He taught at the university as a scientist before coming to Rome. Okay? And he says, politics must not be subject to the economy, nor should the economy be subject to the dictates of an efficiency-driven paradigm of technocracy. He says, politics is often responsible for the dispute in which it is held. We can certainly see that today. He says, we need a politics that is far-sighted and capable of a new integral and interdisciplinary approach to handling the different aspects of the crisis. If politics shows itself incapable of breaking such a perverse logic and remains caught up in inconsequential discussions, we will continue to avoid facing the major problems of humanity. Okay, I'm going to stop. I'm not going to take time for discussion because we don't have a whole lot of time. But I'd like you to think about the question. What have you heard about the environment from those running for public office at the national and or local levels? What have you heard about the common good? When's the last time you heard any politician talk about the common good? These are questions we have to ask them. Okay. Then he talks about the role of technology, and he says, the economy accepts every advance in technology with a view to profit, without concern for its potentially negative impact on human beings. And we're seeing more and more of the negative impact on teenagers particularly, and on the garbage that is just passed along and on and on and on. He says technology, which linked to business interests is presented as the only way of solving these problems, in fact proves incapable of seeing the mysterious network of relations between things. And so sometimes it solves one problem but creates multiple others. And he says, I'm not talking about returning to the Stone Age. He says, I'm just talking about the need to slow down and recover the values we want to pass on and make sure that is a part of our technological advancement. And he says here, starting now, no more white smoke, black smoke. When you announce my successor, please do it via email. He talks frequently throughout the document on integral ecology. He says, since everything is closely interrelated and today's problems call for a vision capable of taking into account every aspect of the global crisis, I suggest that we now consider some elements of an integral ecology, one which clearly respects its human and social dimensions. And the urgent challenge? To protect our common home. And to learn to say the word enough. I was at a UN conference for the UN Environment Program in Germany, and finally someone in the audience stood up and said, you know what? We just need to learn to say enough. I have enough. I don't need any more. And so I think that's what he is talking about here. The need to say, I have enough. And he says, a change in lifestyle could bring healthy pressure to bear on those who wield political, economic, and social power. And this line I think of every single time I walk into a store. Purchasing is always a moral and not simply an economic act. Can I afford it? Yes. Do I need it? Not necessarily. Today, in a word, the issue of environmental degradation challenges us to examine our lifestyle. So he talks about the importance of education and how we are changing our look at education. Climate scientist Katharine Hayhoe wrote a book recently called Saving Us. And she says, it's beyond time when all we can do is threaten people with the catastrophic things that are going to happen. She says, we have to begin to look at what we share in common. We have to find out what binds us. And then we can look together at the future and say, what kind of a future do we want? The Pope says we have to look at critiquing our myths, like individualism. Is that really all that great? Unlimited progress. Competition, consumerism, the unregulated market. Our present economic system is based on the fact that it has to continue to grow. And when you have finite resources, that's no longer possible. So he says what really is needed is a change of heart. We must examine our lives and acknowledge the ways in which we have harmed God's creation through our actions and our failure to act. We need to experience a conversion, a change of heart. And again, he's talking here about the importance of our attitudes, our convictions, our approach to life changing. He says the ecological crisis is a summons to profound interior conversion, an ecological conversion whereby the effects of our encounter with Jesus Christ becomes evident in our relationship with the world around us. And so the question I always ask is, what's your grace margin? I learned this from an Episcopalian priest who did it with a totally different topic, but I think it applies to so many things. In the center is our comfort zone. We like being there. We surround ourselves with people who are like us, think like us, eat the same kind of foods, etc. But God is continually calling us out of our comfort zone, into our grace margin. But for each one of us, that is different. Okay? For someone who's been recycling forever, they need to go one step beyond that. But for someone who's never recycled, maybe that's the first step for them. And so it's not a matter of being in competition with each other. It's a matter of looking at ourselves and saying, what is my grace margin? Where is God calling me? Because God is continually calling us out of our comfort zone. What you don't want to do is push people into their fear zone, which is what all the statistics on climate change do. And it just paralyzes people. So we want to see what is possible. Okay? Then what we're seeing now with Laudato Si is the 7-year action platform. Okay, a 7-year journey of sustainability for Earth and all of her inhabitants. So what is the platform? Well, it's a collaboration between the Vatican, an international coalition of Catholic organizations, and all men and women of goodwill. It seeks to create a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts, and it empowers decisive action here and now on the way to adopting full sustainability in the spirit of integral ecology. It emphasizes the importance of the deep relations and connections between each other, our Creator, and all creation. And it's designed to bring together the people of the world around this endeavor. Okay? And so there are 7 goals that were put forth. The response to the cry of the earth, a call to protect our common home for the well-being of all as we equitably address the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and ecological sustainability. To hear the cry of the poor, what is our response? It's a call to promote eco-justice, aware that we are called to defend human life from conception to death and all forms of life on Earth. Another goal is ecological economics, a call to acknowledge that the economy is a subsystem of human society, which itself is embedded within the biosphere, our common home. So we can't keep building, buying, without looking about the effect it has on our environment. And I found this statistic to be a very interesting one. How well off are the world's richest people? 1% of the population owns 50% of the world's wealth. Everybody else shares the other 50%. So it's why we're seeing the uprising, the discontent that we're seeing all over. Okay? And so Pope Francis says to us, we have created new idols. The worship of the golden calf of old has found a new and heartless image in the cult of money and the dictatorship of an economy which is faceless and lacking any truly humane goal. Another goal is the adoption of sustainable lifestyles. It's grounded in the idea of sufficiency and promoting moderation in the uses of resources and energy. So again, think to yourself, what's your grace margin? What are you being called to? The importance of ecological education, rethinking and redesigning curricular and institutional reform in the spirit of integral ecology in order to foster ecological awareness and transformative action. So many of us are involved in education, perhaps not to the extent that we once were, but we are with adults in many ways. So what kind of education are we promoting? The importance of ecological spirituality, a profound ecological conversion that helps us to discover God in all things. And every one of these is a workshop unto itself. The importance of community, resilience, and empowerment. We're on this journey together, Pope Francis says. We don't have to do it alone. You know, there are over 1 billion Catholics in the world. Imagine if we lived out of our own Catholic social teachings. We could transform the world tomorrow. Okay, so it's a 7-year journey. And he divides it into 7 different groups. So there are guidelines for each of these groups on the Laudato Si platform. For families, for parishes and dioceses, for educational institutions, for hospitals and healthcare centers, for the economy, for organizations, and for religious congregations. Okay? I was speaking with Sheila Kinsey and Andrea Echevarria, who are working with the sisters on their Laudato Si Action platforms. And Amy said to me, one of the problems we're having with religious communities is that they're already so far ahead of everybody else. Because I said, you know, by when do we have to have our plan in? What's the final date? She said, we've decided there's no date at all. She said, because you are so far ahead. But that doesn't give us a pass. It simply means we have to look at what more can we do, okay? So I'd like to leave you with a parable, because one of the things that people often say is, what does my little action mean? You know, does my turning off the lights really matter? So next time you're inclined to say, but it doesn't affect me, remember this parable. It's called the mousetrap. A mouse looked through the crack in the wall and saw the farmer and his wife open a package. What food might this contain, the mouse wondered. He was devastated to discover it was a mousetrap. Retreating to the farmyard, the mouse proclaimed the warning, "There is a mousetrap in the house! There's a mousetrap in the house!" The chicken clucked and scratched, raised her head and said, "Mr. Mouse, I can tell this is of grave concern to you, but it is of no consequence to me. I cannot be bothered by it." So he turns to the pig and yells, "There's a mousetrap in the house!" And the pig sympathized but said, "I am so very sorry, Mr. Mouse, but there is nothing I can do about it but pray. Be assured you are in my prayers." How many times have we heard that with gun violence? The mouse turned to the cow and screamed, "There's a mousetrap in the house." The cow said, "Well, Mr. Mouse, sorry for you, but it's no skin off my nose." So the mouse returned to the house, head down and dejected, to face the farmer's mousetrap alone. That very night, a sound was heard throughout the house, like the sound of a mousetrap catching its prey. The farmer's wife rushed to see what was caught. In the darkness, she did not see it was a venomous snake whose tail the trap had caught. The snake bit the farmer's wife. The farmer rushed her to the hospital, and she returned home with a fever. Everyone knows you treat a fever with fresh chicken soup. So the farmer took his hatchet to the farmyard for the soup's main ingredient. But his wife's sickness continued, so friends and neighbors came to sit with her around the clock. To feed them, the farmer butchered the pig. The farmer's wife did not get well. She died. So many people came for her funeral, the farmer had the cows slaughtered to provide enough meat for all of them. The mouse looked upon it all from his crack in the wall with great sadness. So the next time you hear someone is facing a problem and think it doesn't concern you, remember, when one of us is threatened, we are all at risk. At its core, USCCB tells us, global climate change is not about economic theory or political platforms, nor about partisan advantage or interest group pressures. It is about the future of God's creation and the one human family. And I know most religious are familiar with the idea of the metamorphosis of the monarch butterfly, and that it is within, as it is metamorphosizing, there are cells within it called the imaginative cells. And they are the ones that are calling it to turn into a butterfly. And scientists tell us this is how it works. There's a small group of imaginative cells over here. And all the rest wants to go back to its comfort zone. But those imaginative cells start pulling together and allow for the transformation. And that's our role today. We are the imaginative cells in society. We have to work together, not only with each other, but with all the people around us. And so let's end with a prayer, the Canticle of the Sun, and let's say it together. Praise be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially brother sun, who is the day and through whom you give us light. And he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor and bears a likeness of you, Most High. Praise be you, my Lord, through sister moon and the stars. In heaven you formed them clear and precious and beautiful. Praise be you, my Lord, through brother wind and through the air, cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather through whom you give sustenance to your creatures. Praise be you, my Lord, through Sister Water, who is very useful and humble and precious and chaste. Praise be you, my Lord, through Brother Fire, through whom you light the night, and he is beautiful and playful and robust and strong. Amen. Thank you.